All rise. Her Excellency, Norette Lowry presiding.
You may be seated. This is the matter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony versus Thomas Putnam. Is the government ready to proceed?
The government is ready to
Right.
proceed, Your Honor.
And is the defense ready to proceed?
We are, Your Excellency.
All right, you may begin with opening statement.
Is this thing on? All right. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury and people of Massachusetts Bay Colony, we're here today because in 1692, the town of Salem was bewitched. But not bewitched by actual evil witches, and not bewitched by funny sitcom witches, and not even bewitched by horrible Will Ferrell remake witches. No. The town of Salem was bewitched by one man practicing the magic of deception, and that man is Thomas Putnam. Now, Thomas Putnam deceived his neighbors and convinced them to wreak fear and panic and murder upon Salem. Now, you may have heard of all the people who died in Salem. You may have heard of the people who died in jail, the people who were hanged. But today, the question before us is only that of 4 murders: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, Rebecca Nurse, and George Burroughs. Now, as the prosecution, it is our burden to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Thomas Putnam caused the deaths of these people, that he intended to cause their deaths, and that they are in fact dead. And by the laws of the state of Massachusetts, if we can prove that Thomas Putnam secured the execution of these people for a capital crime by perjury or by suborning perjury, then that counts as causing their deaths. And we will prove that to you today. But you should also know something else about Salem, that Salem is a town bound not only by man's law, but also by other obligations, deeper senses of family, and deeper commitments to God's law. Now, in Salem, you have your family, you have your mother and your father, you have your brothers and sisters, just like everywhere else, but you also have extended family relationships that have the same weight of family obligation. Your mother-in-law, your cousin, your uncles, those all have the same obligations in Salem as your regular family. And so families in Salem form into these clans that are led by patriarchs who are entrusted with the safety, financial well-being, and the spiritual well-being of all of their family. And for the Putnam family, that was Thomas Putnam. Now, I don't feel as a lawyer to tell you much about what the extended consequences for God's law were in Salem. And so we're blessed today to have a sermon from the Reverend Samuel Jackson. And so after Mr. Jackson finishes his sermon about what God's expectations are, I'll tell you how those expectations weigh on Thomas Putnam in this matter.
The path of the righteous man is beset on all sides by the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. Blessed is he who in the name of charity and goodwill shepherds the weak through the valley of darkness, for he is truly his brother's keeper and the finder of lost children. And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger those who attempt to poison and destroy my brothers. And you will know I am the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon
you. Now, Reverend Jackson starts his sermon by talking about how the path of the righteous man is beset on all sides by the inequities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. And that's just the situation we had in Salem. The path of these 4 righteous victims was beset by the selfishness and the tyranny of Thomas Putnam. Now, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were both poor widows trying to struggle to make ends meet. They were, as Jesus said in the New Testament, the least of our brothers, by which we should be judged on our conduct towards them. They deserved God's righteousness, but that's not what they got. And Rebecca Nurse was by all accounts a fine, upstanding woman. She attended church regularly. She was one of the best known people in Salem Village for her purity and righteousnss. And of course we had Reverend George
Objection.
Burroughs.
We need clarification on the names of the 4 victims made in the indictment.
Sure.
I believe those names are Martha Corey, Giles Corey, Rebecca Nurse, and George Burroughs?
Yes.
Yes. Not Sarah Osborne or Sarah Good?
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Right. Okay. Goodwife Martha Corey, a poor soul in Salem whose land was fertile, but who didn't always have the ability and resources to work it, and her husband Giles, who did the best that he could to make that land workable every day. And then, of course, we have Reverend George Burroughs, former minister of Salem, who, after he was driven out of town by the Putnams, took a post in Maine, where he defended his colony in Maine from Indian attacks while being their pastor. He shepherded his flock out of darkness, but he was dragged from the frontier to Salem into the gallows because he was accused of being a witch by Thomas Putnam. Now, in this case, we're going to prove to you that Thomas Putnam caused their deaths. We're going to show how, but also why he did it. We'll show you why. Because Thomas Putnam was a selfish man. Because Thomas Putnam was once the wealthiest man in Salem Village until he was disinherited by both his mother and his mother-in-law. They decided that their fortunes were better fit in the hands of his youngest brother, Joseph Putnam, who, being the baby brother of the family, then married into the rival Porter family. He married the daughter of Isaiah Porter, the richest man in Salem town, a merchant. The Putnams and Porters had been feuding for a long time, and Mr. Putnam saw this as the ultimate betrayal. You'll also see that Thomas Putnam was involved in land feuds with the Nurse family and also the Coreys because he coveted their land. You'll see that he was a selfish man. But we'll also show you how he did these murders. His daughter, Ann Putnam, is here, and though she loves her family, and she once trusted her father, Thomas, with her well-being and her safety and her spiritual righteousness, she now believes that he is evil. And she will tell you that although you may have heard anything about witches in Salem, the only devil in Salem is Thomas Putnam, the man who whispered of witches until 19 of his neighbors had hanged. You'll also hear from her childhood friend, Mary Warren, who will corroborate her story and tell you that the other girls were making up the accusations, but when she tried to speak out about it, she herself was accused of witchcraft and forced to be complicit in their plots. You'll hear from Judge Samuel Sewell. Samuel Sewell is a judge of much fame around these parts, but he was also the presiding officer of the Salem witch trials, the officer of the court. He overheard these trials and believed he was doing God's work, but towards the conclusion of the trials, he realized there were several things wrong with the proceedings, and that Thomas Putnam's influence was on every part of them. He will show you that the court documents reflect that Thomas Putnam and his family members were the accusers on the complaints in almost every case, and that children under their control were always the afflicted, children under the control of Mr. Putnam and his closest allies. Now, you'll also hear that he wrote letters to judges promising them his service in exchange for what they had done. And you'll also hear that he bought the land of Giles and Martha Corey immediately after they were hanged under his accusations. He bought their land at auction. And then, if you're not convinced of Thomas Putnam's influence over the legal process, you'll also hear from handwriting expert Peter Grund. Now, he's a handwriting expert who got his degree from Boston Latin University, and he will tell you that the handwriting on all of the court documents, almost all of them, including the depositions of Ann Putnam and the other accuser girls, were written primarily by Thomas Putnam in words that Peter Grund says could bear no resemblance to what the girls would have said themselves. And after you've heard of the influence he exercised over the legal process, we'll come full circle. You'll hear from Tituba, a former slave of Reverend Parris. Now, after George Burroughs was driven out of town, Reverend Parris became Salem Village's minister, under mostly the influence of Thomas Putnam. He was Putnam's choice for minister. And their girls played together, and they were over at each other's houses all the time. And when Tituba played games from her native homeland, her Caribbean heritage, with the little girls whom she loved, the girls in Reverend Parris's house, Betty Parris, Ann Putnam, she played games with them, but when Mr. Putnam and Mr. Parris heard about that, they beat her until she confessed that these games were witchcraft and that there were hundreds of other witches in Salem to make the ground ripe for their accusations. So you'll hear from Tituba that the very genesis of the Salem witch trials was wrought by Samuel Parris's lash from the orders of Thomas Putnam. And after you've heard all of this, there will be no doubt in your mind that Thomas Putnam's influence is present on every process, on every person that had to do with the Salem witch trials, and you will have no hesitation in returning a verdict of guilty in this case. You will tell the world that Thomas Putnam has poisoned and destroyed his brothers, and though he says he's a God-fearing man, it will become true. He will know the name of the Lord when the court lays its vengeance upon him.
And for the defendant.
Your Excellency, may it please the court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, good evening. We are here today for one reason. Thomas Putnam did his duty and complied with the laws of his land and his God when they commanded him, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." But instead of being recognized for this service, instead he is being charged with a crime. Thomas Putnam first realized witchcraft was being practiced in Salem when he found his own daughter, Anne, and other girls in his household had been trained to use dark magic by a servant in Samuel Parris's household. He saw them contort their bodies on the floors. He heard them scream out in pain and agony as they were afflicted by spirits. And when his daughter came to him and told him who had caused this pain, he did what any caring father would do. He reported those people to the authorities. And from there, the authorities did what the authorities are supposed to do. They held trials, fairly conducted, to prove the guilt or innocence of these people. Now, the prosecution wants you to believe that Thomas Putnam created some elaborate scheme about these trials, and that somehow he is controlling the court or the judges or the process. However, the evidence will show that that is simply not the case. You will hear no evidence today that Thomas Putnam asked any of those girls to lie. You will hear no evidence today that Thomas Putnam lied himself. What you will hear that 9 judges were called in by the governor of Massachusetts himself to overhear and oversee these trials. You will hear that eminent pastors from New England attended these trials. These are not people that are easily controlled by a yeoman farmer from Salem Village. You will hear that Thomas Putnam overheard and saw witchcraft being practiced in Salem. You will hear from Abigail Williams, a woman afflicted by these witches, and who testifies today, as she testified then, that she and the others were in fact victims of witchcraft. You will hear, even from the prosecution, that witchcraft was alive and well in Salem. And finally, you will hear from Cotton Mather, one of the foremost experts on religion and witchcraft in New England, who will tell you that the trials were conducted properly and those convicted in the trials were in fact witches. In sum, we believe that based on this evidence, there's only one just result to reach in this case, and that is the acquittal of Thomas Putnam on all charges. Thank you.
At this time, you may call your first witness.
Excellency, the prosecution calls Ann Putnam.
Please step forward. You may be seated here, Ms. Putnam.
Ms. Putnam,
Yes,
do you know this man?
yes,
Who is this man?
he's my father.
Thomas Putnam.
Yes, my father, Thomas Putnam.
What did Thomas Putnam cause you to do?
My father, Thomas Putnam, caused me to accuse and be an instrument of death to 19 innocent people.
Let's talk for a moment about how Thomas Putnam caused this to happen. During the time of the trials, how old were you?
I had just turned 12.
And as your father, would it be fair to say that Thomas Putnam was your guide and shepherd?
Yes, he's my father. A woman is but clay in her father's hands until she's given to her husband.
Now, did there come a time where Thomas Putnam would take you to the Reverend Parris's house
Quite often,
Objection,
actually.
leading the witness.
Foundational, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Quite often.
Quite often. While you were there, who did you play with?
I would play with Abigail Williams and Betty Paris and Tituba. She was our governess of sorts.
Now, Abigail Williams and Betty Paris, what role, if any, did they play during the trials?
They were also afflicted girls.
And when you say afflicted girls, tell the jury what you mean.
From the beginning,
From the beginning.
well, we girls, as well as Mary, would often play with Tituba games from her native lands, and about mid-February, my father found us playing with some egg yolks. We would look into them and see what shapes were there and pretend that we could tell what it meant.
Now, you say you were pretending to tell what it meant.
Tituba would tell us what a certain swirl might mean. It never turned out to be true.
And your father observed this.
He did.
And what did he say to you?
He became very angry with me and said that what she was doing was witchcraft, was wrong. And then all he and Reverend Paris would ever talk about was witchcraft. As a woman and as a young woman, I would never be privy to these conversations until directly after that incident. All of a sudden, I was sitting in on 2-3 times a week conversations with Reverend Paris about what witches can do, what witches look like, what afflicted people do when they are afflicted by witches.
Are you saying that you heard a description of what afflicted people do?
What symptoms they have, yes.
Describe the symptoms.
There was a case or something had happened where they would contort, where they would be bitten, where there would be, pardon my French, witches' teats. It was a bite on the chest of a girl, and it was from a witch, and many afflicted people had them.
When was the first time you heard about this physical evidence of witchcraft?
Mid-February 1692.
And that was from the mouth of your father
And Reverend Paris.
and Reverend Paris.
Yes.
After you heard about how people behaved when they were afflicted, what did you do next?
Well, I started seeing witches everywhere. I mean, every time there was a cold wind that would go past my neck, I thought, could that woman be a witch? Could this be witchcraft? Could I be afflicted? And soon the other girls felt it, and there was hysteria.
Who ever told you that you were not afflicted?
That I was not afflicted?
That you were not afflicted?
Rebecca Nurse, once, she was trying to defend herself against us.
So you, the daughter of Thomas Putnam,
Yes.
ended up accusing people of being witches, did you not?
I did.
Why did you do that?
Because he said that's what happened. Because my father, because the person I trusted the most in my life told me that if these things happen, that means witchcraft. And then Tituba said she was a witch, and then she said that Goody Good and Goody Osborne were witches, and in the mind of an 12-year-old, it seemed to make sense. And then Goody Nurse was accused, and I didn't believe it. And
Before you continue, let me ask you, of those you accused, how many of them were Putnams?
none.
Can you, for the jury, describe the nature of the familial relationship within the Putnams?
Well, there's my father, Thomas, his younger brother, Jonathan, and that family structure was explained. My mother was Ann Carr. She also had close relationships with the Putnams before she married my father. Everyone was very close-knit. It was a battalion of warriors for God. It was parents protecting their children from evil, and then those children growing up to honor their parents' wishes and do as they were told. And everything was, I guess you would consider on a team. We were Team Putnam.
Very well. I'm going to show you what's been marked, if I may, Your Honor. Approach,
You may proceed.
counsel. Prosecution Exhibit 1, the Putnam family hierarchy. Can you identify that?
Yes. This
And-
looks like a family tree.
Whose family?
Mine.
And who is at the head of the family?
My father.
Now, you told the jury that those accused were not Putnams.
Correct.
And when you talk about family, you're not just talking about direct blood, are you?
No, people that were married into the family. A mother-in-law is just as important as a mother.
Very well. You wanted to talk about
Rebecca Nurse.
Rebecca Nurse. Can you say whether or not Ms. Nurse was in the Porter family?
She was a good friend of the Porters.
Can you describe for the jury the nature of the relationship between the Putnams and the Porters?
The Porters were the wealthiest house in Salem town. We were the wealthiest house in Salem village until a interesting turn of events led my father from the top of the hierarchy to somewhere near the bottom.
These were financial events?
Financial events, he was disinherited for inability to deal with money correctly.
And you were aware of the feud between the Putnams and the Porters?
At the age of 12, I was vaguely aware that there were people my dad didn't like as much as others, but I never thought it would come to this.
Well, how did the name of Nurse come to your attention?
Well, after Tituba confessed to being a witch, and Goody Good and Goody Osborne were convicted of being witches, my father told me that I'd done very well finding those witches, but it would be much harder to find the others. These witches must be much stronger, and that they would seem like the best, kindest, most innocent women in the village. And so my thoughts automatically went to Goody Nurse. But I told him that that couldn't happen because Goody Nurse was the kindest, sweetest woman in town, one of only 2 women in our town who was given the right of the church council.
And who was the other?
I can't remember her name, but I know she's dead.
Was it one of the Coreys?
Yes. It was Goodwife Corey.
And so you spoke to your father about Rebecca Nurse, and what did you tell him?
I told him that she couldn't be a witch. She was too kind, too sweet, too loving to be a witch. Surely a witch cannot be loving.
And what did he say to you when you denied that she was a witch?
He told me that if she was innocent, then she would prove her innocence at trial.
Let me ask you, Miss Putnam, are you aware of anyone accused at trial who was tried, who was ever found innocent before Ms. Nurse?
In other places other than Salem?
In Salem, just in Salem.
No.
In other words, everyone who was accused and tried was found guilty of being a witch.
Yes.
And what happened to them?
Rebecca Nurse was found guilty of being a witch and was hung by the neck until dead
And Mistress Corey,
as well.
are you aware of what happened to her husband, Giles?
Yes.
Tell the jury.
Giles Corey refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty because if he had entered a plea of either one, then his land would have been subject to seizure if he was found guilty. So they punished him by putting a board on his chest after strapping him down and putting large stones on the board until it crushed him.
Finally, Ms. Putnam,
Yes.
can you tell the jury who is the only devil in Salem?
My father, Thomas
Objection.
Putnam.
I'm sorry, it's too late. Proceed.
My father, Thomas Putnam, who whispered in my ear until 19 innocent people were dead.
Pass the witness.
Cross-examination.
Hi, Anne.
Hello?
I just want to clarify a couple things to begin with. First of all, your father never once told you that he wanted to accuse a certain person of witchcraft. Is that correct?
No.
No, he never once told you.
He never told us the exact names.
And he never told you to act in a certain way or to go crazy during trial. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And just a clarification point, there were acquittals in the trials, correct? You said there were none before Martha Corey, but there were acquittals, were there not?
There were several near the end.
Yes. Now, your father never questioned any witnesses during trial, is that correct? He never
Not during
questioned.
trial.
He never questioned an accused.
No, his brother did.
And this talk of witchcraft that you spoke of between your father and the Reverend Paris,
Yes.
this all happened after your father saw you playing these, what you call games that Tituba taught you, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And is it fair to say that these games are actually dark magic?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
That one of these games involved looking into a glass of water with an egg yolk to predict the future?
That is correct.
That another game involved a doll whereby if you manipulate the doll, you can actually cause pain to a person somewhere else without touching them?
Hypothetically,
That is not the game that she taught you then?
it never worked.
So you say. And do you think that a loving and caring father might naturally be concerned upon discovering that his daughter had been taught to do these things?
Objection. Speculation.
Sustained.
And so you testified at trials, correct?
Yes, I did.
And that these people had tortured and afflicted you, correct?
Correct.
And your testimony led many people to be tried for witchcraft, right?
Yes.
And several other girls beside you also testified that they were afflicted.
Yes.
Some of these girls included Abigail Williams,
Yes.
Mary Warren,
Yes.
Elizabeth Hubbard,
Yes.
and Mary Wolcott,
Yes.
just to name a few.
Yes.
And all of the individuals who were accused had a chance to plead their innocence, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, I want to ask you about a couple of the other accused individuals. Are you familiar with a town called Beverly?
Yes, it's 3 miles away.
Do you have any reason to know a woman named Dorcas Hoare before she was accused of witchcraft?
No.
No. Okay, how about, are you familiar with the town of Amesbury?
Yes, that's a little farther off, but I think it's 30 miles maybe?
And did you know a person named Susanna Martin at any time previous to her being accused of witchcraft in these trials?
No.
Let's talk a little bit about Mary Warren. She lived with her uncle, Porter, correct?
I don't know if he was her uncle, but she worked for him, yes.
As a maid, that's
As a
correct.
maid.
Okay. And she lived a few miles away, close to the border between Salem Village and Salem Town, is that correct?
Correct.
And it's no secret that your father and Mr. Porter were not great friends, is that correct?
That is correct.
You would not have had much occasion to spend time with Mary Warren then, correct?
Not as much as the others.
And you know that lying is a sin, correct?
Yes.
You believe in the Bible as the Word of God?
Yes.
You believe in the devil?
Yes.
You believe that he can do evil deeds through people even now, is that correct?
Yes.
The Bible tells us not to spread false reports, is that correct?
That is correct. It is the 8th commandment.
And you knew that commandment when you testified during those trials, is that correct?
Yes.
And now you want us to believe that everything you said during those trials was a lie?
It wasn't a lie.
Well, let's talk about your life after the trials for a minute, Anne. Life hasn't been that easy for you after trial, has it?
No, vengeance is swift in Salem.
And by vengeance, you mean that you're not the most popular person in town, and neither is your father, correct?
That would be true.
You're not married?
I'm only 19, so no.
You're not engaged.
No.
Is it fair to say that these trials have something to do with that?
That would be a fair assessment.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Brief redirect?
Brief redirect.
Very brief. Ms. Putnam,
Yes.
you were asked about acquittals.
Yes.
Isn't it true that the acquittals that occurred in the trials occurred after your father had acquired Giles Corey's property?
Yes. It was all at the end as the hysteria was ending.
After the Reverend Burroughs had been hung as a witch?
Yes.
After Reverend Burroughs' replacement, the Reverend Parrish had become the Reverend of Salem Village?
Yes. All the acquittals came in the last months once the hysteria had ended, once people realized what had happened.
And what was that?
Those women weren't witches.
No further questions.
All right, you may step down. And you may call your next witness.
Thank you, Excellency. The prosecution calls Mary Warren.
Ms. Warren, if you would step forward, please.
Ms. Warren,
Yes.
please tell the jury what your relationship is to the Porter family.
Do you mean the Proctor family or the Porter family?
Porter.
Oh. I have no relationship with them that I know of.
Very well. Were you one of the little girls involved in the Salem witch trials?
Well, I don't know if I was that little, but I was definitely involved.
How old were you?
20.
Very well. Did there come a time after the trials where you ceased to believe in witches?
Oh, yes.
What happened?
Well, I was accused myself of being a witch, and I know that I'm not a witch. So, I realized that all of those girls were faking. Yeah, so I just, I went to prison for a month, and that's when I had time to really reflect on what had happened, and I realized that there were not witches.
What did you do to get out of prison?
I accused a bunch more people of being witches.
And please tell the jury why you did that.
Well, I didn't want to be accused of being a witch. I didn't want to be hung until I was dead. Also, my parents were dead. I had no one to protect me other than my boss, who's kind of a meanie butt. So, and I also have a sister, and she's disabled, and so I was worried. And so I accused all of those other people of being witches.
Would it also be fair to say that you did it to get out of jail?
Yes.
No further questions.
Who is that old man? He is not my attorney.
Oh, will become clear in time, madam.
Okay.
Ms. Warren, just to review a few facts, you lived at the home of the Proctors, John and Elizabeth, correct?
Yes, I lived with John and Elizabeth Proctor.
And your master, Mr. Proctor, was not especially friendly with Thomas Putnam, is that correct?
I don't believe so.
And just to help the jury understand the locations, the Proctor house is near the border of Salem Town and Salem Village, correct?
Yes.
And that would be a few miles walk from both the parsonage, where Reverend Parris lived, and from the home of Thomas Putnam and his family, correct?
Correct.
And you would have little occasion or excuse to travel such a distance, correct?
I mean, unless I was delivering potatoes or something, I usually would not.
And therefore, you would rarely have had occasion to visit Abigail Williams or Ann Putnam, correct?
Correct.
So if we could turn for the moment now to the accusations of witchcraft. Thomas Putnam, whom you just testified you had very few occasions to see, he never told you to accuse anyone of witchcraft, correct?
No, he never told me that.
And he never told you what to say in any testimony, correct?
No, I never talked to the dude.
And therefore, since you never spoke to the man, he never told you to lie, correct?
Not necessarily.
Did he tell you to lie, or did he not?
He did not directly tell me to lie ever.
The man to whom you never spoke.
Never spoke to him.
Thank you. And the same is true of Reverend Parris, in that he also never told you to lie, correct?
No, he did. In his sermons, he said, "Do not lie."
As for your master, Mr. Proctor, he opposed your involvement in the witchcraft trials, correct?
Oh, yes.
Indeed, he beat you after learning of your initial participation, correct?
Yeah.
And after you received your beating, you initially attempted to recant your testimony, saying you knew nothing of witchcraft, correct?
That is correct. I did not want to be beaten again.
But instead of that ending your involvement, you ended up accused yourself, correct?
Yes, and that was really dumb.
And upon rigorous examination of you by Mr. Hawthorne, you then accused several persons of witchcraft, correct?
Yes, because I did not want to be hung.
And among those you accused was Mr. Proctor, who until then had been your master, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Proctor was eventually executed for witchcraft, correct?
It was really sad.
And you testified today that your prior testimony, that being the testimony you gave in Salem in 1692, was false, correct?
Correct.
Meaning that you admit to offering false testimony that got your own master executed, correct?
Yes, I suppose so.
And before you gave that fatal testimony, you swore to tell the truth, just as you swore to tell the truth today, correct?
Correct.
Must be confusing keeping track of what testimony of yours is true and what is false, is it not?
It is confusing for a lot of people because a lot of people lie.
And yet you are not here accused of any crime on trial for your life, correct?
That is correct.
Returning to your accusation of Mr. Proctor, you stated in court back in 1692 that his specter appeared before you and that you pulled him down into your lap, correct?
I think that is what I thought was going on at the time.
But your testimony today is that you did no such thing, correct?
No, I did it. I just don't think that it actually happened anymore.
So, in fact, your description of having Mr. Proctor in your lap was just a fantasy of yours, correct?
Maybe.
No further questions.
Nothing further for this witness.
All right. You may step down.
Oh my God! There's a witch! Oh, there's a bird! Oh, there's a bird! We're all going to die.
All right. Wait a second. What's going on here? Recess. Let's take a recess, a 10-minute recess to become organized here.
Your Honor, Your Excellency, would it, not to question the rulings of the court, but might it be better to reserve this recess for the close of the prosecution's case? As was suggested earlier, might be the order of events.
Perhaps that would be a wise choice.
We're ready to continue.
Glad to have help. You may call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Despite the antics of Big Bird, the state now calls Judge Samuel Sewell.
Judge Sewell, come forward.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Can you please state your name for the record, sir?
My name is Judge Samuel Sewell.
And can you tell us your connection to the events in Salem?
I was one of the judges that oversaw the witch trials themselves.
And as a judge, how did you see your role?
I saw mine, well, the court itself is called, it's called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which means to hear and determine. I saw myself as somebody to hear and determine the truth of the matter, to see what was happening.
And did you think that you were doing good works?
Initially I did. By the end of the trial, I seriously questioned our position, though.
And what caused you to question your position?
Well, there were a number of incidents that made me question the veracity of a lot of the statements that the young girls were making about the witches. For instance, most of the 30 accusations that our court oversaw, 27 of them came from Mr. Putnam, or they came from a member of Mr. Putnam's immediate family.
Whoa, now, hold on. So you're basing that assessment on the actual records of the court?
Well, the records I kept, yes.
Right, so they were regularly kept by the court in the course of business?
I kept them over the course, yes.
And you're familiar with them, and you since you kept them yourself, you know how they were kept, and you know about their authenticity?
They are my records, yes.
Okay, I'm now showing you your analysis of these records. Is that a fair and accurate representation of what that is?
This is absolutely fair and accurate.
Okay. Your Honor.
What did you want me to do with it?
Just one second. I just wanted to show it to defense counsel. I move that the analysis of Judge Sewell's records be admitted into evidence and published to the jury.
Any objection?
Object only that it appears to be quite incomplete in that the court records, at least those reviewed by the defense, suggest that there were 200 persons jailed at one time or another related to the witch trials, and there are only 30 names or so on that sheet.
I'll overrule the objection. You may proceed.
Thank you. Now, so we have 10 of the records available for the jury, and they all include all of the counts of this indictment, all the records including counts of this indictment. Now, Judge Sewell, you said you noticed a pattern with these court records. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And what pattern was that?
Pattern was that the name Putnam kept showing up on the list of the accusers.
Thomas Putnam and his extended family kept
Yeah.
showing up. Okay. So the Putnams made up the vast majority of the accusers.
Absolutely. I believe 27 of the 30 that I saw.
And did you notice any pattern with the afflicted girls?
The afflicted girls were all women who were either, well, as you heard Miss Putnam state, she is Mr. Putnam, she is Thomas Putnam's daughter, but they all had direct contact with Mr. Putnam, or they were very well acquainted with Mr. Putnam being the defendant, Thomas.
And this pattern is true for Giles and Martha Corey.
Absolutely.
And is it also true for Rebecca Nurse?
It is.
And is it also true for George Burroughs? All right.
Sadly, yes.
Thank you. Now, were there any other occurrences that caused you to see Thomas Putnam's influence?
Well, you mentioned Mr. Burroughs. George Burroughs was a good man. He was the reverend of our town. He was somebody that we felt should oversee our spiritual guidance. But we didn't pay him enough. He was a very well-educated man. wanted to lead us to God, and we didn't give him enough to pay the toll, as it were. So he had to borrow from many of the townspeople, and one of the townspeople he borrowed most from was Mr. Putnam. Unfortunately, as I said, we couldn't pay him enough, and he had eventually had enough, and he had to flee town, or he had to leave town for bigger waters, and but he left with us owing him money, but Thomas Putnam seemed to take umbrage at the fact that he still owed him a bit for Mr. Putnam's kindness.
So you have reason to believe that Mr. Putnam had a grudge against George Burroughs?
Absolutely.
And did you see any other instances of corruption or influence from Thomas Putnam on the court?
Well, Mr. Putnam, he wrote my brethren Hathorne and Corwin, saying that he would be forever in their debt, or he could never repay them for their duties, but that he would like to, and it's my suspicion that he did.
What is this that I'm hearing?
Objection. Did you say is suspicion? To be clear, he's not testifying on the basis of personal knowledge?
He saw the letter himself.
Are you raising an objection?
I would like to object to his answer that he's speculating and not speaking on the basis of personal knowledge.
He
has
has
no idea.
already answered the question.
He answered a question that wasn't asked. He just went on to speculate about some personal knowledge that he doesn't have, Your Honor.
Do you wish to strike the answer?
I do, Your Honor.
The answer is stricken. You are instructed to disregard the statement.
Judge, just to make it clear, I'm just asking you about the contents of the letter. We don't need your opinion on what the letter might mean.
You can ask your question, direct your witness.
All right, so this is the letter that he wrote. Is that not true?
This is.
Okay. I move that this letter that I'm showing you the judge and defense counsel be admitted into evidence. It's a letter from Thomas Putnam to Judges Hawthorne and Corwin.
No objection.
It's admitted.
Just as a matter of course, is it appropriate to thank judges for what they do on the bench and promise them that you'll be in their service?
As judges, it is our highest duty to remain neutral and to give no sense of impropriety. So writing from one party or one accuser to the judges is horribly inappropriate.
Thank you. Now, did Thomas Putnam also write a letter to you?
He did.
And what was the regards of that letter?
That was the letter that unfortunately helped Mr. Giles Corey see his end. He told me that his daughter Ann had witnessed Mr. Corey using rocks to crush a person to death.
And based on that letter, how did that affect the court's action?
Well, as you heard earlier, Mr. Corey refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. So under a process called paying forte et dure, Mr. Putnam suggested that in order to compel a plea, that we do what was called pressing.
And is this a copy of the letter that he wrote detailing the suggested pressing of Giles Corey?
This is.
Okay. I move that this letter from Thomas Putnam to Judge Samuel Sewell advocating for the pressing of Giles Corey be admitted into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
It's admitted.
Thank you. Now, had, to your knowledge, the punishment of pressing been used anywhere in the American colonies?
This was the first time that pressing had been used.
And would the court have ever pressed Mr. Corey to death if not for the suggestion of Thomas Putnam?
Absolutely not.
All right. Now, after the trial, did you have any occasion did you see Thomas Putnam doing anything else that caused doubt in your mind about his motives?
When a person is found guilty of a felony, in this case, witchcraft, all of their land, all of their holdings, their assets are forfeited to the crown. It's then sold off piecemeal or as a whole. It's sold. That's where it's auctioned to the public itself. In this case, I thought that Mr. Corey's land and the lands of the other folk would be auctioned in the same way. I happened upon a private auction between between Thomas Putnam and the sheriff of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he was buying the land of Giles and Martha Corey.
He bought the land of Giles and Martha Corey days after they died?
Very soon after, yes.
After he and his daughter accused them of witchcraft.
Yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Judge Sewell, if I could, I'd like to begin a little bit with your background. You're a Harvard-educated man, is that correct?
I am very proud of the Crimson, yes.
And indeed got not one, but 2 degrees. Is that right?
I did.
Is it true the saying that you can always tell a Harvard man, but that you can't tell him much?
Given that it's the only college in the country, I'm going to deny that.
Have you heard, perhaps, of the college being founded in New Haven by those who believe that the college in Cambridge has slipped from its perch of correct doctrine? Scheduled to open up next year.
Oh, you're talking about those nerds over at Yale?
Of whom you are apparently one of the founders.
Yes, they're in a good way.
Well,
I have many wheelings and dealings. I can't be entrusted to keep track of them all.
Let us move on. Is it true that traditionally folks who get the master's degree at Harvard, in addition to the bachelor's degree, normally enter the ministry, but that you instead went into business?
Normally they do, yes. The ministry is not well-paying, as you can tell from my testimony about Mr. Burroughs.
So you did, however, do the requisite study so that you could have been a minister had you so wished, correct?
Yes, if I wanted to, I could have been.
So I'd like to ask you a few questions, if we could, having such a learned authority here. It's not common that a man with 2 Harvard degrees sets foot in this town. Some questions about the Bible. Is it true that the Bible says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live"?
It is true.
And perhaps the relevant phrases could be displayed to the court as I continue. Is it also true that the Bible says, "A man also or a woman that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death"?
The Lord does say that, although it does sound like something only a lawyer could parse.
How about when you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations?
The Lord also says that, yes.
And the next sentence, making clear what practices are at issue, says, "There shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch."
That is forbidden by the Bible, yes.
And indeed, this rule applies to all persons, even kings. Was it not said of King Saul? Saul said unto his servants, "Seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her, and inquire of her." And his servants said to him, "Behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor."
Saul did seek that woman out, yes.
And after he found her, the Bible informs us, so Saul died for his transgression which he committed against the Lord, for asking counsel of one that had a familiar spirit to inquire of it.
It does say that Saul died. I would like to point out, mentions nothing about the woman.
In any event, is your opinion that every word of the Holy Scriptures is true and correct?
That is my opinion, yes.
So moving from the holy law to the more secular realm, I'd like to ask you a few questions about English law, which I understand is also taught to Harvard graduates. Is that correct?
On occasion.
Particularly those who go into the judicial service as you have yourself.
Yes.
Is it true that the English kings have passed multiple statutes on witchcraft, including a statute in 1542 by King Henry VIII?
Yes, they have.
And an act against conjurations, enchantments, and witchcraft, 1562 by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth?
Kings and queens get bored, yes.
And yet another one by King James in 1604.
Yes.
Is it your understanding that the Lord our God or our majesties pass laws to ban practices that do not exist?
No, my understanding is that they're generally trying to forbid something that has or will happen.
If I could move to the issue of pain forte adure, the pressing of Giles Corey. As an educated man, are you familiar that in English law, this is a practice that has long been observed, and indeed as recently as 1658, George Strangeways was pressed to death after he failed to plead to the court in England?
I am aware of him, but that was in England, not in the colonies.
Are you aware that in both England and in the colonies, the project of forfeiture, as you mentioned, quite commonly the money does not go to the king, since the king is far away, but instead that the king's officials are charged with disposing of that property?
Yes, I'm familiar with that practice.
Now let me turn to your own judicial service. You were chosen as a judge for the court of Oyer and Terminer by Governor Phipps himself, correct?
Yes,
And this was after Governor Phipps had recently come back from England with the new charter by their Majesties William and Mary, correct?
yes,
And you had prior judicial experience on the Court of Assistants, correct?
yes, I did.
And Governor Phipps instructed you to conduct the proceedings in accordance with the laws and customs of England and Massachusetts, correct?
Yes, he did.
Did you conduct them so to the best of your ability?
Initially, I felt that I was doing it to the best of my ability. I became more, I became less sure as the trials went on.
Before 1692, you did not know Thomas Putnam of Salem, who is the defendant today, correct?
Correct.
Indeed, you had never heard of him, correct?
No.
Judge Sewell, is it true that you've written a diary,
I have written a diary, yes.
and that you made a copy of that diary available before this trial?
Yes, after I pulled it and unlocked it with the key that was in my locket, yes.
Your Honor, if I may approach the witness, I'd like to show him this diary,
You may.
whose admissibility has been stipulated to. I ask him to turn to page 72, and we'll look at the portion for the 19th of August, 1692. Did you not write there, "This day, George Burroughs, John Willard, John Proctor, Martha Carrier, and George Jacobs were executed at Salem"?
Yes, I did.
And did you not further write, "Mr. Cotton Mather was there. All of them said they were innocent, Carrier and all. Mr. Mather says they all died by righteous sentence"?
I did write that.
And did you write further, "Mr. Burroughs, by his speech, prayer, protestation of innocence, did much move unthinking persons"?
I did write that.
So it was, to be clear, it was the unthinking persons who doubted his guilt, and not the thinking persons such as yourself.
At the time, that is what I wrote, yes.
And did you not write in the margins, after having written the above text, "Doleful witchcraft"?
Yes, I did.
And if we might turn to the next entry for September 19, did you not write, "About noon at Salem, Giles Corey was pressed to death for standing mute. Much pains was used with him 2 days, one after another, by the court and Captain Gardner of Nantucket, who had been his acquaintance, but all in vain"?
I did write that.
In other words, the court made its best efforts, as did friends of the accused, and still he defied the court and would not even plead not guilty. Correct?
It's correct. I would, I may not use the phrasing "best efforts" in regard to crushing a man with boulders, but
It's a diligent
We did.
way to convince a man to plead, is it not?
it is.
Thank you. I have no further questions with the diary, but I'll turn for a moment now to a few other matters. Thank you. When Reverend Burroughs was arrested, you personally participated in the pretrial investigation and questioning, did you not?
I did.
And during that questioning, Reverend Burroughs admitted that he could not even remember when he had last taken communion, did he not?
He did say that.
And he further admitted that while you might think that could be the case because he was a lone preacher up in the hinterlands of Maine, in fact, he had attended recently multiple church services at which communion was offered, but did not partake, correct?
Correct.
Strange behavior for a minister of the gospel, correct?
Strange, yes.
Finally, you wrote a letter to your father-in-law, John Hale, in 1694, a couple of years after the Salem trials, and you wrote that witchcraft is appropriately deemed to be a capital offense in Massachusetts, correct?
Oh, it's appropriate.
And that is appropriate because the Bible so commands it, correct?
Yes.
Finally, just to clear up a couple, perhaps, inaccuracies, confusion that might have been sown in the jury during your direct testimony. You mentioned the 30 cases that were shown on the chart. It is, in fact, the case, though, that more than 200 persons were jailed on accusations of witchcraft before the trials were all complete. Is that
Jailed.
right?
Jailed, yes.
Yes. And with respect to the so-called accusers on that chart, to be clear, those are the persons that reported the accusations, that wrote up the details of the accusations, not the folks who claimed to be afflicted by witchcraft themselves, correct?
They did write the accusations, yeah.
So many persons not named Putnam, not close to the Putnams, were involved in the accusations as opposed to the transcriptions, correct?
Yes.
I've got no more use for this guy.
Very free to direct, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Judge Sewell, we heard a little bit about your divinity credentials. Do you believe that it's possible for a man to be deceived by the devil into thinking he's doing God's work when he's not?
Absolutely.
And knowing what you now know about Thomas Putnam's influence, what do you think happened in the trial?
Objection, speculation.
What is your opinion? How do you feel about your role in the trials?
I feel that I was deceived, that initially I felt I was doing God's work, but I believe that was the trick of the devil. That by the end, I knew that there was no way that what we would be handing was a righteous sentence, that what we would be doing to these people was in any way right under God.
And if you had known the things that you now know about the patterns of Thomas Putnam's influence, would you have given the
Objection,
same
speculation.
Sustained.
Do you think the outcome would have been different?
Objection, speculation.
Still sustained.
No further questions.
You may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Does the prosecution have another witness?
Yes, Your Honor. We call handwriting expert Peter Grund to the stand. Thank you, sir. Can you state your name for the court, please?
My name is Professor Peter Grund. I'm a professor of grammar linguistics at Boston Latin College.
Can you tell us a little bit about your education and what exactly it means to study grammar linguistics?
Well, I went initially to the college to study the classics. I was always fascinated by the Latin language. In my opinion, it's a very beautiful language, a very flowing language. Some call it a dead language, but I happen to disagree with that. I am absolutely fascinated by the handwriting analysis process. I know it's kind of a weird, quirky, eccentric fascination, but it was what I was passionate about, and so it's really the only place in the country where I could have explored that, so that's why I went there, and shortly afterwards continued on, and they offered me a professorship.
And so you study handwriting and how to compare handwriting forensically, is that right?
That is correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about the methods that you use when you're doing your analysis?
Sure. There are traditionally 4 factors that any handwriting expert would look at if you're looking at various samples and trying to conclude if they came from the same person. One of those factors is form. You look at how the letters and how the words, how they slant, how they curve, just how the person writes the actual letters and words themselves. Then you look at something what's known as line formation. Essentially, it's how hard they're pressing down. It's the depth, the boldness of the writing that they are putting out on the paper. Next, you look at the arrangement, which is fairly similar to the formation, but it's not exactly, it's more of the spacing and the way the sentences and the lines differ and not the exact letters themselves. And then you would look at the content of the words on the paper. You look at punctuation, you look at grammar, spelling, the choice of word themselves. You combine all 4 of these factors together, and looking at all 4 of those, a handwriting expert can tell you, yes, all of these samples come together from the same person, or no, there are distinct enough differences so that they are not from the same person. One of these is a forgery.
And when this method is applied by an expert, is it reliable?
Oh, yes.
Is it popular and peer-reviewed? Is it well known to be reliable?
Yes, these 4 factors, these are the 4 factors that any handwriting expert worth his salt will use in any proper handwriting analysis technique. It is used by pretty much every other handwriting expert that I've talked to.
And Did you have a chance to apply your methods and your factors to the documents at hand in the case?
I did. I was called in to look at the depositions of all of the accusers. I believe there were over 100. I looked at them, and after looking at these 4 factors, specifically the content was key, I concluded that it was Thomas Putnam who wrote down all of these depositions brought on behalf of the female girl accusers.
So you're saying that he exercised essentially complete control over what they wrote?
Objection. I don't believe this man has any personal knowledge of what the girl said.
You may rephrase your question.
Sure. So did the documents that you reviewed, the depositions, did they bear any resemblance to what the girls would have written themselves?
Objection. I don't believe that the witnesses met any of these girls.
Were they written, how were they phrased in the wording that a 12-year-old girl would use? Based on your experience with how people write, is it the content written like a 12-year-old girl would write a deposition?
In my opinion, looking at the content of the depositions that I examined, and given my knowledge of the current social hierarchical standings, in my opinion, the girls could not have realistically used the words that are written down in these depositions.
And are they all written in such a way that it's very reliable, very possible that Thomas Putnam wrote them himself, using the words that he chose?
It is my understanding, and I did conclude that Thomas Putnam chose the words that appeared in these depositions.
Thank you very much.
Professor, just to be clear at the outset, you have no personal knowledge whatsoever of the witchcraft at Salem, correct?
That is correct. I do not live in the town of Salem. I was called in specifically to look at these depositions.
And that's after the trials had all concluded. You attended none of the trials, correct?
I attended none of the trials. I was only called in after the fact to look at these depositions. That is correct.
And even after the fact, you've interviewed none of the witnesses, correct?
I have interviewed none of the witnesses. That is correct.
Thank you. Would it surprise you then, perhaps, to learn that the accusers were of varied ages and that many of them were far older than 12, and some of them were adults? You would have no way of knowing if that were the case, correct?
I would have no way of knowing that. The context I was given when I was given these depositions was simply the fact that these were girls who were accusing people in the town of Salem to be witches.
So if some of the accusers were, say, 20 or 21, or even in their 30s or 40s, that might call into question certain of your analysis, correct?
Most definitely, I would say if some of the accusers were in their 30s and 40s, that would, I would have to reevaluate my analysis of the content. As to whether or not, how bright is the line we draw between the age of 12 and the age of 21, there is to be certain some distinction to be drawn in those ages. I do not believe that the difference between 21 and 12 is so great as to completely invalidate my analysis, however.
I'll ask no further questions about your opinions on the difference between a girl of 12 and 21, and we'll move on instead to more quotidian matters, just the manner in which depositions are traditionally written in this colony. Is it correct that it's common practice that a person writing a complaint down is not the actual fact witness?
That has happened, yes. That is a common practice.
And this is especially true when the witness cannot write, correct?
That is correct, yes.
And most people in this colony, despite the efforts of schools such as yours, cannot write, correct?
Unfortunately, that is correct, yes.
And this would be particularly true of girls in some backwater far from Boston, correct?
If you're referring to Salem, I would not go to the level to say it is backwater, but I would say, yes, girls brought up in this town likely do not have the handwriting and reading abilities to form their own complaints.
And when a scribe writes on behalf of an unlettered person, it is common for the writer to paraphrase the spoken words of the witness, recording the essence of the report, and not even attempt to write the exact verbiage, correct?
That does happen. yes, but a scribe writing down a complaint he is not required to use the exact words. That is not realistically feasible in all circumstances. So to answer your question, yes, it is a common practice for a scribe to not use the exact words, but to paraphrase it in order to get the fullest, most complete general idea across.
Meaning that if the same person served as the scribe for multiple witnesses, the complaints of those witnesses would tend to be recorded with similar phrases and diction, correct?
I suppose that is correct, yes. If it's one person writing all of these depositions down, then if that person has his own idiosyncratic ways of writing, his own choice of words, then that would show up as he is summing up the complaints of other people. That's correct.
So if a handwriting expert were handed a subset of all complaints filed, specifically only those written by a single man, and not all the rest of the universe of complaints written by other people, that then an expert might conclude that those ones are written by someone who appears to be the same person. Correct?
That would make sense, yes.
And that nothing sinister would necessarily be drawn from the fact that when the same person writes a few different things down, they appear to have been written by the same person. Correct?
It doesn't rise to the level of sinister. I would call into question the decision to use the same person for over 100 depositions, but that being said, I cannot draw a sinister motive from that choice, however foolish it may be.
And to be clear, if there were multiple people writing them down, and I believe even the chart that was shown earlier doesn't have the same person writing 100 complaints, but in any event, turning to the law for a minute, because of rules concerning the use of hearsay against criminal defendants would prohibit the offering of these written complaints in a criminal trial, at the actual trial, the fact witnesses, the folks who saw and heard the relevant information, would be expected to testify viva voce, that is, in their own voice, correct?
Yes.
Meaning the trier of fact would get to hear it from the horse's mouth, as we say in Salem, as opposed to from something that needs to be examined by a handwriting expert.
I believe that is how the trials were carried out, yes.
I have no further questions, and Your Honor, I move that the entirety of this man's testimony be stricken from the record as irrelevant. There are no disputes about the writing of any document relevant to this case.
Overruled.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Oops. You may step down.
Your Honor. Excellency, as our last witness, we call Tituba to the stand.
If you'd come forward, please, and be seated.
Alrighty then. All right. Tell the jury your name.
My name is Tituba. Tituba. Not to be confused with tuba.
Very well. Tituba, not confused with tuba. Do you know the defendant?
Yes, I do.
And how do you know the defendant?
I know him because he always came over to Reverend Paris's house.
That's right. And what was your relationship to Reverend Paris?
Reverend Paris bought me in Barbados and brought me here to Salem.
So how long had you been with Reverend Paris prior to the trials?
About 12 years.
All right. Now, there's been testimony offered in this case that you were accused of witchcraft.
That's correct.
That's correct. And you had a conversation with the Reverend and with the defendant, Thomas Putnam, about confessing to being a witch.
Well, they told me to confess. They thought it was best for Salem.
But you didn't initially.
Well, not initially. I mean, he kind of convinced me in different ways.
Well, tell the jury how he convinced you.
Well, you know, just typical beating and whatnot for a servant who has been bought from a plantation.
Yes. So, you were beaten?
That is correct.
Did you confess after you were beaten?
That is also correct.
And what of your husband and your child?
Well, I was afraid for their lives, so I did what they told me to because I cared for them.
Were you ever a witch?
I'm not sure.
But we are sure, are we not, that you confessed to being a witch because you were beaten
Yes.
and the lives of your husband and child were threatened?
Yes, this is true.
Very well. No further questions.
Tituba, you were born in Venezuela, correct?
Yes.
And you said you worked on a plantation in Barbados for 6 years.
Yes,
correct?
that was pretty awful.
And then Reverend Paris bought you and
Yes. I was
brought
very happy
you
for that.
to Massachusetts, where you live with him in Salem, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And once you moved to Salem with Reverend Paris, you became acquainted with some girls from Salem Village. Is that correct?
Yes, very nice girls.
Some of these girls were Ann Putnam,
Yes.
Elizabeth Hubbard, Abigail Williams.
Mm-hmm.
Is it true that you taught some of these girls to perform certain types of magic?
Well, it's not exactly magic.
Let's see. One of these types of magic involves using a glass with a egg yolk in it in order to tell the future. Is that correct?
Your Honor, I'll object to the question. The witness has testified that it wasn't exactly magic.
Overruled.
One of the things you taught them was to use a glass full of water with the yolk in it in order to tell the future. Is that correct?
Yes, but they weren't very good.
Could I, permission to approach the witness, please, Your Excellency?
You may.
Is this a fair and accurate representation of a Venus glass?
It looks kind of gross, but yes.
Thank you. And another thing that you taught these girls involves using a doll, correct, to cause certain things to happen to someone not in the room?
Yes, but it doesn't always work.
Your Excellency, permission to approach the witness? Is this a fair and accurate representation of one of these dolls?
Maybe. Let me. I don't know. I don't know if this actually. I guess it works.
And so sometimes, in your experience, this can work, can it not?
Sometimes, yes.
So it's fair to say that you taught these girls to create supernatural effects with these games that you taught them.
Well, supernatural, I'm not sure.
Now, when you went to live with Reverend Paris, he taught you about the evil nature of the devil. Is that correct?
Of course he did. He's a preacher.
Of the devil and his servants, correct?
Yes?
And you believe that spirits are real, don't you, Tituba?
Of course they're real, but I only know the good kind.
And you've seen spirits, haven't you?
Yes, only the good kind, though.
You say that you've seen a dog,
Oh, yes.
you've
Well,
seen a cat,
They're not, well, those are my pets.
both an orange one and a black one.
Yeah, those are my pets.
You've seen a hog.
That's also my pet.
You've seen a monster named Osborne.
He's not my pet.
And you've seen a devil man, correct?
Yes, this is also true.
And this devil man asked you to do evil things, correct?
Well, yeah, one time he asked me to pinch somebody, but, you know.
And did you pinch that person, Tituba?
Yes, I did.
And so, subsequent to seeing these things, you confessed to being a witch, correct?
Well, I was a witch then, but now I'm not a witch.
But you confessed to being a witch in your deposition, did you not?
This is true, but that's because
Okay.
I was a witch then, but now I'm not a witch anymore.
But yet, you were never tried as a witch, were you?
That's because I'm not a witch.
You were never convicted or executed of witchcraft, even though you confessed,
But I'm
correct?
not a witch right now. I mean, I don't know.
Did you or did you not confess to being a witch?
Yes, back then I did.
And yet you were not executed back then for witchcraft, even though witchcraft is a capital offense in this colony.
No, I was not.
Instead, the prosecution called you today, a confessed practitioner of witchcraft, to give testimony against Mr. Putnam.
Well, yes, that's what they just did.
Yes. But now you say you're not a witch.
Well, I mean, you're telling me that I'm a witch, or maybe I'm not a witch. I'm not sure if I'm a
You
witch right now.
confessed to being a witch, under oath.
But I was a witch then, and now I'm not a witch, and now apparently I'm a witch right now.
But
I'm not sure.
Do you see spirits, Tituba?
I see spirits all the time.
Do you see spirits now?
I mean, I see spirits over there, and I see spirits right there, and I see spirit right there.
Oh,
And like,
she's a witch! She's a witch! Witch! Sabine, come help! She's a witch! She's touching me!
No further questions, Your Honor.
Oh, wait! Order in the courtroom.